My name is Drew Kientzy. I'm an agriculture business specialist at MU Extension, and I'm going to dive into a little bit about the economics and potential ROI and how you can figure out the ROI of virtual fence on your farm. So, the one big point of value that virtual fence can bring is that it decouples the cost of fencing from the land. We think about traditional fencing, whether that be a woven wire fence plus a barbed wire on top or a 5-strand barbed wire fence. It's all got wire, it's all got corner posts, it's all got line posts, and it's very much tied to how much distance of fence you're putting in terms of what the total cost is. However, so when we look at a field or like a pasture I got on top out west in the range state, if we might only be able to stock 50 cows in that 2,000 acre pasture, and it's going to cost a whole heck of a lot to be able to put a fence around that, even though we might be able to put a somewhat lesser fence on that than what we could back here, where we can stock 50 cows in 70 or 80 acres for a big part of the summer. But virtual fence allows us to take that from a per acre fence cost to a per head fence cost. So when we start to break down our virtual fence, obviously there's different components of what the cost structure is, and that differs by every company. But in general, we're going to have some component that is a collar and other hardware purchase. So just for running the bill, not to single out any particular brand, we can say, if we say our collar and hardware purchase is $300 over a 6-year lifespan, it's going to average out to $50 per head per year. Additionally, we add on top of that a subscription cost that might be associated. So not particularly with any brand, say that's $50 a year. Then if we have management labor that's associated with getting the system up and running and then the ongoing maintenance. So first, we talked a lot earlier about how much time it takes to put the collars on the head. And you can do it slower than this, you can do it faster, but say it takes us 5 minutes to put a collar on. By the time we average that out, at $25 or $22.50 an hour labor rate, that's only going to cost us 31 cents to put that collar on over the 6-year life of that collar. If we take 8 hours to train the operator on the system, train the cows to use the virtual fence, and go through our pastures to keep them relatively clean of any obstacles that are going to cause problems, that's going to come out to 10 minutes per head in a 50 cow herd, or 59 cents per head per year. So again, that time commitment, while it seems like a pretty big chunk up front, quickly gets boiled down once we start to break it out on a per head and per year basis. The last component of our labor cost is going to be the ongoing management labor of the system. So if we figured that for a group of cows we have virtual fence on, it might take us an hour every week to go into our app and draw our paddocks and do whatever virtual fence associated management is. And it could be less, could be more, depending on how you want to use it. But for assuming an hour per week per group, that's going to come out to $23.40 throughout the year per head. So when we add all those three things together, our labor costs per head per year comes out to $24.30 for a total annual cost of the virtual fencing of about $124 on the labor side. And that kind of, when we talk, the cost side obviously has to come away from what our value propositions of the virtual fence are in order to be able to generate an ROI. And our farmer panel did a really, really great job of walking through a lot of the value that they see from the virtual fence in terms of forage utilization, increased flexibility for their operation, being able to save time and management and general labor on their operation, and also creating affordable access to temporary forages. And I do want to harp on that a little bit more because I think it's one of the most important aspects in terms of the value of virtual fence and creating that ROI, because whether we're grazing crop residue or grazing permanent pasture, if we have an 80-acre crop field that we want to graze for 45 days in the fall, it could cost us a traditional fence just as much to fence that for that 45 days we're going to use it out of the year as it would a different pasture in the summer that we're going to graze for 120, 150 days, however long that might be. But virtual fence, since we take that to a per head basis, gives us a lot more flexibility on it. It cuts down on that fencing cost because that fence is tied to the animal rather than tied to the land. And while we can talk all day about the value that's created for each individual operation, but at the end of the day, guys we heard from up here made it pretty clear that the value each of them gets on there for them is very, very different. So I'm not going to attempt to show you just exactly what kind of value you're going to get because it's going to be very different. But what I'm going to give is a tool that you all can use to actually go in and figure out what the ROI of virtual fence is going to be for your specific situation. So the value of a so my tool here is something we just recently developed. Got the first version up online on Tuesday, but it's a spreadsheet that you can find on the internet on the MU Extension webpage. I encourage you to take a picture of that so you can use that link once you get home to find my tool. But this is the introduction page. Gives a quick little snapshot for how to use the tool and how to navigate through it. Once we actually get to the editing process, the first place we're going to get to is this general assumptions entry. And this is where we're going to fill out some general information about your operation. And I do have a scenario plugged in here for kind of a run-of-the-mill Missouri cow-calf herd. I'm very non-specific about my different inputs, but don't want to harp on that too much. But it's basically just to show you how the tool is going to work in order to calculate the ROI. But this is our general assumptions. The values in gray throughout my whole tool are where you're going to enter the values off your farm and be able to edit that spreadsheet tool. The second place we're going to get to is our fence and water systems. This is where we can customize the investment that we're making into that system. So we break down on a line-by-line basis the different cost components of that virtual fence system, whether that be an upfront collar purchase if the system you're using includes that, a tower or beacon if that's something that you're going to need, any spare collars you want to have in case one fails or something like that, and installation and training labor. Basically, all the one-time costs associated with our virtual fence are going to go in here. Additionally, we are also going to add in any improvements to the water system that are going in there as well. And I think we heard a lot about water before, but water is certainly a big component of the virtual fence conversation when it comes to generating ROI, because while we don't necessarily need to go away from kind of our typical water system where we might have, say, this is my 80-acre property, and I've got a stock pond up there on the north portion, I've got a creek running through the south, and a couple water tanks over here by the barn. And if that's great for our continuous grazing where we got it split in half with one permanent fence. But if we go to start talking about a typical management-intensive grazing system, and we're going to break that up with straight poly wires all across the farm, well, all of a sudden we don't have access to water in all of our paddocks anymore. So then we're going to have to put in a fairly extensive watering system in order to get water to all those pastures. And this would certainly be great for a virtual fence setup as well because we have all those tanks. But if we're going to be new to to management-intensive grazing rather, and all of a sudden all our straight lines can go away and we have the flexibility to draw whatever paddocks we want, this might be overkill. So if we're new to a system, now we can say, well, let's take a step back and rethink what we actually need. And because we can curve those lines around, if we still get water distributed fairly evenly across the property, we can use some creative fencing to still end up with some ideal manure distribution and good forage utilization across the whole farm with a little bit less of a water investment. So back to the tool again, the next place we're going to get to is kind of where we start to input some of the actual information for the value we're going to get out of the virtual fence system. And I had those 4 different value propositions earlier, but really we can boil all the impacts down into changes in stocking rate, reduction in hay feeding, and labor savings, or labor that's going into our virtual fence relative to our other scenario. And this is one of 2 places we're going to see a scenario assumption sheet. In the tool, there are 2 different or 2 different scenario options. One is going from continuous grazing to virtual fence, and the other is an existing management grazing user using electric fence, switching over to virtual, but those tools look very, very similar. And I'm just going to walk through the continuous grazing one today in the interest of time. The next place we can go to in our tool is the partial budget analysis. And this takes in all of our scenario assumptions, all of our general farm information in order to say, well, how much additional money are we making based on having this virtual fence system? How much can we reduce the costs in our operation in order to have some savings there? And those are going to be added together in the positive column for ROI. And then we have the additional costs that we have based on using the virtual fence system. So the fence and water system, if we're stocking heavier, any extra cow costs we might have on the ownership side or the operating cost side, and any additional repairs and maintenance we might have on account of that expanded fence and water system. And then lastly, our reduced returns, where if we were in a case where adding that system were to happen to reduce our income for some reason, that's where that would be put in. And those 2 things are going to add together to go into the negative column, working against the positive effects of the virtual fence system. And then finally at the bottom, we have what our actual ROI calculation is for our whole farm operation on per cow basis. in a per acre basis. And I intentionally put my scenario together to come away with a negative ROI in this scenario to show you kind of the value of the third part of our tool, which is a sensitivity analysis. And this is basically to give it a good perspective for if I make a change to my system and add some additional value and use my fence a little bit better to have a little bit better stocking rate, get a few more grazing days out of it, how quickly can I be in the positive ROI territory? Or if I'm already in the positive ROI territory, how intensively can I manage to be even better and get even more value out of my system? And there's two different ways we can look at that. Either if there's a gray box there where you can change from either selecting a change in stocking rate or a change in our virtual fence costs, and that's going to change the parameters over here on the side for how much improvement we're getting with our virtual fence to see a net return per cow based on having the virtual fence out in the matrix there. The second option looks something like this, based on the change of virtual fence costs per head. And as you can see, it doesn't take much in either scenario based on how I have it plugged in order to get in positive territory. And I think that's a big portion of the value of the tool, is to be able to see how those small incremental changes really maximize the value of using the virtual fence technology. Excuse me. So the final component of our return on investment calculator tool is the forage access evaluator. And this is basically showing where the reduced cost of grazing gives you an advantage over feeding by the time we implement all our additional costs associated with the grazing operations. So here, again, we're going to go in, put in all of the information about our additional grazing system. We're going to talk about what costs we have in that pasture, in that forage we're grazing. And then we're going to compare that to the cost that we have in that stored forage, whether that be silage, TMR, feeding round bales, whatever that might be. We've got the cost of our feed, information about how much the cows are eating. And then finally, the operating or the cost associated with feeding between our machinery and our time in order to produce the total cost of feeding versus the total cost of grazing. Then if we subtract the cost of grazing from the cost of feeding, and we have all of our costs entered pretty honestly here, the difference we come away with will be the total advantage to grazing and the value that virtual fence provides by giving us the access to graze those forages we might not have been able to before. That's going to do it for me today. There's going to be further iterations coming for the tool. The first one we have is strictly for cow-calf operations. We have one in the works for stocker cattle, and we'll be continuing to make improvements as we go through. But please give me a call sometime if you want some help working through the tool. There's definitely a possibility we bring this into sheep and goats here in the future. And I'm happy to work through with you and figure out what virtual fence can do on your farm in terms of ROI. And my example today did not include any cost share programs, but there is the ability to include cost share either issued on an annual basis in the partial budget or issued on a one-time basis through on the fence and equipment page for those one-time cost share payments that are all coming up front.